My name is Emilie Max, and I work as a researcher at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. And it is my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to this event on Afghanistan. To talk about what has unfolded in Afghanistan over the past 10 weeks, we have with us today three distinguished panelists. First, we have Dr. Chiara Rederi, who is a research fellow at the Geneva Academy and a visiting professor at the Université Catholique de Lille. We have also Sarah Kay, who is a human rights lawyer and activist. And last but not least, we have Professor Fionnuala Ní Éoláin, I hope I said that properly, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights while countering terrorism. Today's discussion is going to last for 1 hour and 15 minutes. We're going to spend about 45 minutes with our panelists' presentation, and then you will have the opportunity to ask them questions through the chat feature. I will take the question on a first come and first serve basis and might group them in clusters if some of them address similar issues. Two last points before we get started. Professor Ní Éoláin is only with us for 1 hour. So if you have questions addressed specifically for her, please flag it in the chat feature. And the second thing I wanted to say is I'm fully aware, and the Academy is fully aware, that the work on Afghanistan, in Afghanistan, and with people still in Afghanistan and awaiting evacuation has been particularly difficult. I know this is a polarizing topic and a difficult one, so I would encourage everybody to be kind and benevolent in today's interaction. And on that note, I very much look forward to the discussion, and we'll give the floor to Chiara.
Thank you, Emily, for organizing this event and for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Now, we don't have much time, so I will jump immediately on it. And my presentation and what I'm going to talk now wants to answer one simple question with a not so simple answer, which is, who is the government in Afghanistan? And are the Taliban the government in Afghanistan? And now the problem here, and the reason why answering this question is so difficult and problematic, is that under international law, there is a tendency to recognize states and not governments. So this draws back to the so-called Estrada doctrine that was put forward in 1930 by the Mexican foreign minister, Genaro Estrada, who basically said that states should recognize other states and not governments. There are very good reasons for what he said and his positions. Now, the problem is that sometimes states have to recognize governments. And this happens in particular when you have two competing entities that both claim to be the government representing the state. And we might think, for instance, as a parenthesis, what's happening now in the UK when there is a claim between Maduro and Guaido, where they both claim that they should have access to the gold in the British National Bank, and the British National Bank doesn't know who should have access to the Venezuelan gold. So in practice, there are some cases when you need to recognize a government and you need to make this decision. However, because officially there is the approach whereby states recognize other states and not governments, under international law, we don't have clear-cut criteria in order to identify the government. And now under general international law, we have two possible approaches. One approach is the effectiveness approach, which basically means if a government has effective control over the territory and the population, this entity is going to be recognized as the government of the state. However, this position was predominant especially in the 1980s, 1990s. However, about 20 years ago, another position, another approach started to emerge, which is the democratic entitlement approach. And under this approach, which has emerged also thanks to several resolutions and declarations adopted, for instance, by the African Union, the Organization of American States. Basically, under this approach, if you have two competing authorities, so let's imagine, for instance, that there is a government that was democratically elected through free and fair elections. This government loses power due to a coup d'etat. Now, under the effective control approach, if the government that reached power through the coup d'etat is exercising effective control over the territory and the population, this basically means that this should be recognized and this should be considered as the government representing the state. However, what the approach adopted by the African Union, by the Organization of American States, and also in general by practice of the international community over the years, is that if a government is democratically elected, then it tends to be preferred over the undemocratic one, even if the democratic government is not in effective control. Now, these are the two theories that have emerged in the state practice and also in the scholarship. Personally, I have conducted research on this, and I actually recently published a book where I addressed this issue. So I'm going to present now my personal analysis and how do you test these two theories against state practice and how does this apply to Afghanistan? Because now the problem in Afghanistan is that we have the Taliban and they are in effective control over the territory and the population. Nobody is really officially recognizing them, but are they the government of Afghanistan or not? And now my analysis and what I see in state practice seems to suggest that whenever you have a democratic alternative, so you have two authorities that both claim to be the government, normally the democratic alternative, so the government that was elected through free and fair elections is the one that tends to be recognized. And one example is, for instance, what happened in the Gambia in 2017, where there were the elections. The incumbent president refused to step down. However, the president, Adama Barrow, who won the elections, he was recognized by the international community, the UN, the majority of states, as the president of the Gambia, even if he had never been in power, and he was sworn in as president in the embassy in Senegal. So this is only one example, there are many others, but really shows that whenever you have a democratic alternative, so someone who was elected, these alternatives tends to be preferred over the undemocratic one. So for instance, in the case of the Gambia, the president will refuse to step down. Now, when it comes, we have like, what about the case of Afghanistan? What about what we have now? Now, whenever you don't have this democratic alternative, then at the end of the day, the government that is going to be recognized, or the entity that is considered as the government, is the entity which has effective control over the territory and the population. And this is basically what's happening now in Afghanistan, where apart from recognition, which in my opinion is not necessary to be the government, you don't also need recognition. So recognition is only declarative in my view. But anyway, so leaving aside the fact that nobody's really willing to openly recognize the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan, if you don't have an alternative, if you don't have a democratic alternative, and the government that we had before kind of disappeared, then the undemocratic but entity which is exercising effective control should be considered the government. Now, this is about the analysis under general international law, but this is an IHL talk, so I'm going to talk about IHL as well. And now under IHL, the commentaries of the ICRC express the majoritarian view, whereby the government, that the entity that should be recognized as the government is the effective one. So under IHL, we don't really have the idea that if you were democratically elected, and you lose power, you're not in control anymore, you are still the government. Under IHL, the majoritarian view says that whenever you exercise, and as long as you exercise effective control over the territory and the population, then you are the government. And this is very important under IHL, and especially with, in the case of Afghanistan, because in Afghanistan, before the Taliban took power, we had a non-international armed conflict between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban. And then we had another non-international armed conflict that was basically between a number of rebel groups and the government. And now, as soon as the Taliban become the new government, meaning that they are effectively in control of the country, then on the one hand, they continue the armed conflicts that were existing before. However, the question is what happens to the conflict that was taking place between the Taliban and the government, because now they switch sides. And the problem is that with this regard, IHL doesn't provide clear-cut answers. So we have two possibilities. We can claim that that conflict was over as soon as the Taliban became the new government, because basically they won the rebellion. They succeeded in becoming the new government, and that NAYAC is over. Another possibility is to say that actually the conflict, and admitted that the fighting is still ongoing, which is based on my sources, at least quite unclear, because according to the Taliban, there is no fighting between the Taliban and forces loyal to the former government, while according to these forces, we're still fighting. But admitting that there is indeed still fighting, then we might claim that this is actually the same NAYAC that is continuing, but simply the parties switched sides. Now, the reason why this is important to be determined, whether it's the same conflict or a new one, is that if we maintain that it's a new conflict, then we have to reassess from scratch the intensity of violence. And if the intensity of violence is not met, then we don't have an NAYAC. My personal view, but again, it's open to discussion, and I'm happy to cover it and to address it during the Q&A, is that if we consider that it's the same conflict, in my view, it makes more sense because the parties are the same, they switch sides, that's true. But if we then claim, but they never stop fighting, basically, they're kind of the same people. The only difference is that the Taliban are not the rebel forces anymore, they're the government, and the governmental forces are now on the former governmental forces are now on the other side. So in my view, this is why we should consider it as a continuation of the previous conflict. Now, with regard to, so this is about the conflict between the NAYACs that were involving the former government of Afghanistan. However, there was also another NAYAC in Afghanistan that was taking place between the US and the Taliban. Now, in the moment when the Taliban took power and became the new government, well, the majority of the US forces left already, and now, based on my information, no US forces are present on the ground, but should there be forces on the ground, then the NAYAC between the US and the Taliban would now be an international armed conflict between, on the one hand, the US and on the other hand, Afghanistan, because now the Taliban represents Afghanistan because they are the government of Afghanistan. Now I will stop here because I'm eager to hear from my co-panelists. Thank you again for your attention, and thank you, Emily, for the invitation.
Thank you, Clara, sorry, for laying out so clearly the different options and lack of certainty under international law, and how This lack of certainty and the theory that one chooses to adopt has also an impact on the classification of the situation, and then therefore on the protective rule that apply on the ground. And I'm sure that there will be questions about the consequences in terms of protection. So now I want to turn to you, Fionnuala, to talk a little bit about the response of the international community from a more practical, but maybe also political perspective.
Sure, thank you. I'm very glad to join you this morning. So maybe just to start by acknowledging, before we talk about the current moment, to talk about the scale of the human rights violations that have taken place in Afghanistan over really many months and years. And it's in that backdrop that I think the broader issues of responsibilities and accountabilities, as well as current action, should be placed. I think many on the call will be aware that the violence in Afghanistan leading up to the point of the fall of Kabul really had reached egregious heights. We saw a range of devastating and escalating tactics that directly targeted civilians, including by non-state actor group designated as terrorists or individuals associated with them designated as terrorist groups by UN sanctions regimes and national sanctions regimes. We saw attacks on women and girls exercising a range of rights, from the right to freedom of education. We saw attacks on civil society, academics, health workers, human rights defenders, media workers, and civil servants. You know, in the months leading up to the fall of Kabul, there seemed to be a perverse logic at play, which is that if you were able to silence human rights defenders in the civilian population exercising their human rights and fundamental freedoms, that that was part of the broader objectives that we were seeing being played out by the non-state groups in context. It's just, again, the scale and the systematic nature of those attacks, including attacks on a girls' high school in May of this year, killing 90 people, wounding many more. I think for those interested and concerned about women's rights in particular, it's really clear that targeting women, targeting girls exercising their right to education and equality were really at the forefront of the kinds of tactics that were being used. I think it's also clear that the push for accountability for the violations that have taken place in Afghanistan doesn't only attach to the non-state actor, the Taliban, but a broader set of accountabilities that include the accountabilities of the government of Afghanistan for serious human rights abuses stretching back many, many years before the current situation, but also the responsibilities of actors, external actors, including the United States, for the use of drones and other states for their consistent use of force and the consequences of that in Afghanistan. So it's with that backdrop that we look at the kind of current state of play around accountability in Afghanistan. Just to say, the other piece of the picture right now is the scale of the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. So it's worth noting that at least we understand a sizable part of the population, near 70% of the population, to be food insecure at this time. And winter is coming in Afghanistan already. And the implications of that are a humanitarian catastrophe on top of an already extreme and unstable humanitarian situation. The third piece of this is those who have left Afghanistan. And for now, I just really want to particularly focus on individuals in neighboring states. So we've seen a large number of persons displaced or migrating. Many of them are undocumented and have arrived in countries, neighboring countries or others, without the kinds of documentations that allow them either to stay or to be processed. We're seeing severe limitations and restrictions placed on those people who have made it to neighboring countries within those countries. We are seeing actually the borders now only being open if you want to go back, meaning that there's been a closure of borders in the neighboring states. And we're also seeing policies and practices of non-refoulement in neighboring states, with reports that there are up to 2,000 daily deportations from Iran, 1,800 deportations total from Pakistan since about September 1st. And that's in the context of a global migrant and refugee crisis. We've seen an unwillingness of states who've said they will stand by Afghan civil society to take in any more people from that country. So these are overlapping kind of and complex questions that are all sort of interfacing with one another at this point. And so let me start by focusing on the issues of accountability. As early as 6 months ago, UN special procedure mechanisms led by my own mandate were arguing for a fact-finding mission, a fact-finding capacity or mechanism to be established for Afghanistan, which predates the current egregious situation. Ultimately, there was support from the Afghan government to that endeavor. And I think one of the most depressing moments, there were many, many depressing moments this summer, but one highlight moment for me in a way was the moment during the emergency debate on Afghanistan in Geneva, when the Afghan ambassador was pleading for a robust oversight mechanism for human rights violations in the country of Afghanistan. And the international community ignored him and said that the High Commissioner could report, as she does anyway, in a couple of weeks' time to the Human Rights Council in September. Now, since then, we've had the establishment of a fact-finding, of a special rapporteur for Afghanistan. And that's progress in some way, but I do want to underscore, without undermining my own métier as special rapporteur, the limits of our offices. Our offices are not designed to oversee systemic, large-scale human rights violations that require meticulous fact-finding and forensic evidence collection on the ground. As many in the call will know, in Geneva, many of our existing country special rapporteurs have no access in country, and one does not anticipate that access would be granted in the current situation. And would be troublesome. So you create a mechanism which effectively is hampered in its capacity to look at any of the things that there is broad agreement from Afghan civil society and from some states need urgent attention. And it's probably worth a footnote to note that the support to that special rapporteur was produced by collapsing the oversight mechanism on Yemen. The two were traded off. So we lose one for the other. And that speaks to both to the broader lack of resources in UN special procedure mechanisms, as well as the unwillingness to put in place additional resources to address the broader issues of accountability and responsibilities for the long-standing, widespread, systematic human rights violations that have taken place on the territory of Afghanistan. Let me now turn to say something about the humanitarian catastrophe, and in particular to focus on the thorny question of sanctions. So as many will be aware, a significant number of the individuals who are currently members of the government or the effective authority of Afghanistan are individuals listed on UN designated terrorist sanctions lists. Now, to understand very precisely what this means is to know that when we seek to engage in the necessary humanitarian action that will be needed to address the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, the general working method has been to work through government ministries. And there's some complex and obviously challenging legal questions when those government ministries are now led by individuals who sit on designated sanctions lists. And the consequence of that is that many understand that if they were to work through government ministries, they themselves will fall into the dragnet of enabling, supporting, or material support provisions in national settings of aiding and abetting terrorism. It should also be clear in the last report of the 1267 Monitoring Committee to the Security Council in June this year, that the monitoring committee was unequivocal in its assessment of the ongoing ties between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, making the practical case, so if the case was that we had an assessment that said, well, the Taliban is no longer engaged or supportive or associative with Al-Qaeda, which is in part the basis for the individual designations in this case, then you would have a basis to perhaps look at the sanctions regime, look at the individual sanctions designations. But that is certainly not the case from a security assessment point of view. So that leaves us with a really difficult question as to how we manage the functioning of humanitarian aid and independent humanitarian action in the space, which is now so difficult to access on multiple grounds. And what it speaks to, the 1267 sanctions regime is up for renewal this fall. That resolution is upcoming. And one of the things that many of the listeners will know is that we've had a long-standing challenge in putting in place exemptions for impartial humanitarian action to enable impartial humanitarian actors to function in situations or contexts that have been designated or defined as involving terrorism or terrorist actors. And so the result is we're sort of at a really thorny impasse, because the bottom line, which the mandate IHL has been arguing for in New York with states on the Security Council, in line with other scholars and some of them are at the Geneva Academy, is that we need consistent humanitarian exemptions in these counterterrorism sanctions regimes. And only when we put in place those exemptions will we be in a place to ensure that impartial humanitarian actors can do their work effectively and safely. It's worth noting that the United States, the Treasury Department issued 2 general licenses in the last 10 days. And this has been the general mechanism that the United States has used to enable humanitarian access to contexts where sanctions regimes may be in place. The Europeans generally use a slightly different mechanism called derogations, but they're more or less the same in practice. And but one of the challenges is, even in reading those licenses, those of us who spend time looking at these things, they still leave a great deal of imprecision and lack of clarity about which actions may run foul of the sanctions regimes. And I think it's fair to say that those of us who wish to preserve that idea of impartial humanitarian action being protected under the conventions would be deeply concerned in a move that essentially rarefies and affirms the rights of states to simply engage in licensing, as opposed to the legal obligations of states to enable and protect impartial humanitarian action as protected by international humanitarian law. So this is an important time, I think, not just for Afghanistan, in ensuring that we have in the next couple of months, which will be a really ferocious negotiation in New York. The US is the pen holder on the 1267 resolution. So to argue for the case, to make the case for humanitarian exceptions, humanitarian carve-outs, but also the precedent that might set for a broader set of conflict settings in which terrorism lists or sanctions designations are functioning to imperil or limit impartial humanitarian access and work. Let me simply close by saying that many of these issues now are sitting on at the Security Council, and in particular, this questions of sanctions will be essential to the immediate catastrophe in front of us, which is the need for ensuring humanitarian access and the engagement of a broad variety of humanitarian actors, including those within the UN system, to prevent and support the Afghan people in the months ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such an exhaustive and also honest assessment of what has been done and said within the United Nations, and also for flagging places where advocacy work needs to be done in future months, and also underscoring the trade-offs that achieving results might entail sometimes. Now, last but not least, I want to give you the floor, Sarah, to speak a little bit about the voluntary work you've been doing with human rights defenders in Afghanistan to ensure their evacuation.
Hi, thank you so much, Emily, for organizing this. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Chiara and to Dr. Nialine for speaking so honestly, candidly, and so expertly. I hope my internet connection is going to stick. So as Emily said, I have been a volunteer in those evacuations from Afghanistan since the fall of Kabul. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It's difficult. It still is. It shouldn't be, because it's been 2.5 months, and this should not still be, to this day, a volunteer effort. Many, including Dr. Nialine here, have lobbied for a humanitarian corridor. Sadly, as most of you here know, the United Nations Security Council resolution of the 30th of August said that no, there will not be a humanitarian corridor, that everybody was just waiting to see if the Taliban were going to comply with the human rights obligations and the obligations under international humanitarian law. This did not happen. This will likely not happen. I'm not one in favor of waiting and seeing to see if insurgent groups are going to protect human rights defenders. So what happened basically is that some of us received phone calls to say that, you know, Kabul had fallen, and the security situation was very rapidly deteriorating. And there was, of course, full knowledge that there was coalition states, military forces present still on the ground, obviously, and that those states were only going to be present until a certain date. So this deadline was set up by President Joe Biden for the 31st of August. And UK forces followed suit, and French and German forces left shortly before that, and a small Swedish contingent. Through those military evacuations, those states' evacuations, they are nationals, which, you know, is not an issue in itself, it's a legal obligation. Civilians just gathered en masse to the airport, to Hamid Karzai International Airport, in the hope of having a seat on those planes and to be able to leave Afghanistan. This was a desperate move. It was a move out of a complete lack of option, of a total knowledge that for those who had worked so tirelessly for the last 2 decades to build Afghan civil society, to change the landscape of the political and educational and activism sphere in Afghanistan, there was just no place left for them. And they came with their families. So very quickly, some legal schemes and resettlement, refugee resettlement, repatriation schemes arose. So the United States, for instance, already had the SIV scheme, which stands for Special Immigrant Visa, which is the scheme under which people, Afghan nationals that had assisted coalition states, namely the US, or even UN bodies, could, with sponsorship of military personnel or UN bodies, could, you know, give proof, and they could re-enter the US to prove they were at risk. The UK has the AMRAP scheme, which is way more narrow, but it's still along the same lines, which is that if this person had been assisting coalition states, there was an understanding this person was at risk and should be given the right to seek asylum in global North states. But sadly, those states are very narrow and demand a degree of involvement and of sponsorship that not every single civilian has. And it does not understand that civil society actors do not necessarily engage with coalition states in the last 20 years. They could have been teachers, they could have been doctors, they could have been any form of grassroots organization that had promoted the education of women and girls, that had sought engagement with foreign nations, that had worked with MSF, for instance, to have access to hospitals, or that had been very present in the media, strong journalistic work that had been coming out of Afghanistan during the last 20 years. There is no scheme for those people. So there are special visas for at-risk human rights defenders that have come up, but it's extremely difficult without access to a lawyer, without a solid grasp of the English language, and without a way out to a third-party country in which this visa can be processed. Those people cannot get out. And of course, this is an insurgency, which means having access to a passport is not an option. So as many of you here, you are more than aware that the issue of documentation in any refugee crisis is an outstanding one. So what happened is that we volunteers and we set up shop, and I worked with Team Dunkirk, which was mostly US Special Forces at that point, because those were the people that I know, those were the people that I had worked with, said, listen, We have access to seats on planes. Can we please get at least our fixers out? And then there was knowledge that, what about those women? What about those girls? What about the dependents? What about UN women staffers? What about UNICEF staffers? What about UNESCO staffers? And what about, again, grassroots civil society? I was at a talk at SOAS Law yesterday, and there's one thing that I want to emphasize. This is not an effort that is meant to drain Afghan civil society of their biggest resources. This is not an effort to make everyone that had worked so much to make Afghanistan a better place for women and girls and for human rights defenders, for them to leave and to never come back. Some human rights defenders have chosen to stay, and it's very important that we all collectively find ways to continue to support them as they resist a Taliban regime. They are working under extreme stress. They are working under extreme dangers. And those dangers are plural, right? So you may have already seen in the media, but I'm not really sure to which extent this has been publicized, that women were told to stay home. So, and that they were not allowed to work with men, especially not men from foreign countries, or specifically if they were from the global north. So that has, drawn the blood out of several organizations that could have been helping dispensing food. And then we started seeing executions. We started seeing stop and searches in houses. And that happened very quickly after the fall of Kabul. As of right now, the UNHCR has estimated over 500,000 in Afghanistan are internally displaced. And as Dr. Nialin said, Afghanistan is facing a drought, a very severe drought, which means that there is very little, if at all, access to food and water in those IDP camps, some of them being set up in very rural regions, which are making even more difficult for humanitarian actors to have access to them and to deliver food and water in those camps. Most of the borders in neighboring countries are shut because very quickly they realized that those who could not find a seat on those flights tried to evacuate by land. So Pakistan very quickly said, we are not going to be handling such a mass influx of refugees from Afghanistan. Uzbekistan is facing ethnic minority conflict. Kazakhstan only has a small, very OHCHR presence, very, very small presence of the OHCHR that is trying to come back to Afghanistan, but of course is facing personal issues. So everyone is pretty much working remotely, and it's very difficult to access papers, and it's very dangerous. So this idea that we can and should somehow legitimize the Taliban government, for me as a human rights lawyer, is something that is very, very difficult. I fully understand the legal consequences of it, and of course it's necessary. Humanitarian action is neutral. If this is who we have to talk to have access to those camps, then this is what we're going to do, and this is what has happened before. The fact that this evacuation was volunteer-led is something that is very surreal, and especially on that scale. So what happened is that you had lawyers in any country in the world that were putting their pro bono resources to process visas as fast as they could, and to ensure that they were being processed in the right countries. And at the same time, there was us trying to guide people to military planes that were taken off through a process, and ensuring they were not going to be dropped in a third-party countries and left to be abandoned and forgotten, which is already starting to happen. Some have started to find evacuation flights that were landing in the Emirates, that were landing in Qatar. And from there, it's a massive question mark as to which country is going to be able to receive them and resettle them and let them access health and shelter and all the rights and entitlements to which refugees have access. So everything has dried up in terms of resources. So now we are just facing a couple here and there that we can take out. Some visa application schemes have closed because the numbers of refugees that we're able to take were capped. And there is a huge advocacy push that is needed to understand that the scale of the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan necessitates a much broader refugee acceptance scheme. But again, it's very true. This refugee crisis is not new. We've had issues with global north countries refusing to accept refugees long before the fall of Kabul. And when Priti Patel, the UK Home Secretary, said in a press conference about the AMRAP scheme in August, It was probably the only time that I ever agreed with Priti Patel when she said, if we open the door to Afghans, who else are we going to open the door to? And that's very true. Why are we opening the door to Yemenis? Why aren't we opening the door to Somalis? Why are we opening the doors to all of those refugees stranded in Greece and Italy? So Priti Patel just opened a scheme for deserving Afghans. So when we talk about deserving Afghans, again, who are we talking about? We are not talking about human rights defenders. This is when the formal withdrawal was very bittersweet. On one hand, that was 20 years of a military deployment that led to nothing except for more terror, more trauma, more violence. But on the other hand, was this the way that we should have left? And I say we very broadly. Many international agencies also evacuated their foreign staff, leaving the Afghan staff behind. And in a way, I find this unforgivable. I can understand in terms of resources and organizational structures. However, they are leaving the Afghan staff to face the Taliban regime without any support and without the protection of having the jacket, the badge, or the identity papers of an international organization that can provide them with shelter in other countries. So those organizations that are still trying to work with skeleton staff and absolutely no resources, because it's extremely difficult to send support to Afghanistan, again, through sanctions. And frankly, it's been difficult. And so now we're starting to see the flip side of any humanitarian crisis, because anything of that scale brings the worst out, which is the privatization of humanitarian support. Private military contractors came into this very, very early on. And this is something that at Dunkirk specifically, we said we would not do, was to engage with private military contractors. But the profit margin of some of those evacuation flights is frankly sickening. And I really hope that at some point there will be a possibility to engage with this in a transparent and equitable way. Private military contractors came back, and they came back because they had knowledge of Afghanistan that very few other bodies had. Because of the securitization of the war on terror, that means that a lot of coalition states contracted private groups to engage in the counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan and also elsewhere, but primarily in Afghanistan. So they said, we know the terrain, we have access to resources, we have funders and backers in the Emirates, we can help. What that means is that you have to pay insane amounts of money to evacuated personnel that should be protected under international humanitarian law. Those are human rights defenders, the entitled to asylum, the entitled to refugee status because they are endangered, especially women and girls. And it's very difficult for some of them to even leave their house or a safe house because there are checkpoints everywhere, because the identity papers is going to place them on some sort of list. And because we know that the Taliban has had access to lists of people who worked for the Ministry of Interior, who worked for the Ministry of Defense, who worked for the Karzai government, and that goes from high-ranking officials to somebody's driver. And they're looking for them. They're actively looking for them because they consider them traitors to Afghanistan. So what are we doing for those people? We need to come back. We need to have an international humanitarian support in Afghanistan. We need to not let those 500,000 people in IDP camps stay there for the years that they might be staying there, because this is what we do now. We have camps. This is the case in Iraq. This is the case in Syria that can never be evacuated because no global north countries is taking refugees anymore. We have no access to food and water. Again, this winter is going to be extremely difficult and is going to be extremely painful. But mostly we need to acknowledge that this is not an insurgency that is going to cooperate. This is not an insurgency that is going to comply. This is not an insurgency that is going to listen to our demands. This is an insurgency that sees human rights lawyers and activists and human rights bodies as the enemy, because we have represented the face of a support in Afghanistan to coalition states for the last 20 years. It's very dangerous for humanitarian actors to be back. It's even more dangerous for the people that have left. So in terms of political legitimization, I'm having a really hard time reconciling the obligations that we have, the need that we have to have access to those camps, have access to those checkpoints, have access to a compound in Kabul, and at the same time, refusing to accept that this is going to be the new normal for Afghanistan until, at some point there is a rebellion and Afghanistan is going to fall back into violence again. But I also do not want anyone to forget that for 20 years, those human rights activists, and some of them for less than 20 years, because some of them are really young and are still working very hard, have tried so much for the country and have committed and invested so much in promoting education, in promoting openness, in promoting alternatives ways to have an engaging and thriving political culture outside of the insurgency. And I think we're leaving them behind. And I think many of the volunteers acted on sheer moral responsibility, perhaps more than an ethical one, perhaps even more than a legal one. And we're just working off the back of our contacts, off the back of the intelligence that we have, off the back of what people tell us. But we only have so many resources, and we are only capable of so much without actually being present, because I'm here in Belfast. We know the UNHCR is trying to start working on something bigger now. IOM is present as well. They're present in a compound in Kabul. The World Food Program has always been there. They have rung the alarm very early on about food shortages. They have also organized evacuation flights through the UN Humanitarian Air Service that unfortunately was limited in its capacity as well. This is a worst case scenario within a worst case context, basically. Is it going to redefine the way that we approach the end of an insurgency or the end of military operations? Perhaps, I'm not sure. This is not a call for coalition states to return to Afghanistan. This is a call to say, well, listen, who you consider to be at-risk persons in Afghanistan is basically any civilian. And this is the reality of living under the Taliban regime. If you're a young man, it's very likely that unless you join the Taliban because they're going to come to recruit you, something is going to happen to you. So I don't know what the future holds for Afghanistan right now. And it's always extremely painful to see so many people seeking to leave because there are no option. This is the only survival option that they have, is to try to resettle anywhere else. But what does it mean for the future of Afghanistan if every single human rights defender is leaving and can never return? So I'm going to leave that there because I've been speaking for too long already, but thank you.
No, thank you, Sarah, for being so honest and also for fleshing out for our audience what it has meant to work on those evacuations and the kind of challenges you faced, but also how those challenges reflect for Afghanistan as a whole, for the people who have left. And it's not because they have left that they are being saved or that they're in a better place than they were before, and also for the people who are staying and what it means to be staying, if it's by choice or not. So thank you for that. Now, if it's okay with everybody, I wanted to turn to the Q&A. We have received several questions so far, and I've also noticed that we have people in the audience who are in Kabul. So thank you so much for tuning in. I'll start maybe by taking a question that is addressed directly to Fionnuala. And it's a question, speaking of moral and legal responsibility and the gap maybe between the two. It's a question by Soraya, who wants to know whether the Qatar and the US have some kind of liability, be it moral or legal, for having facilitated the Doha agreement, and whether that agreement is actually partly to blame for the fall of Afghanistan. And if I may, I want to group this with a second question coming from Mariana, saying that now that the Taliban are in power, and as Chiara mentioned, are the effective government for IHL purposes, there are a lot of different terms being used by NGOs operating in Afghanistan to refer to the Taliban. Is there a legal correct way to refer to the Taliban? And Chiara, maybe you can also chip in. And are the term being used, do they have an impact on ensuring neutrality towards all stakeholders? So Fionnuala maybe first, and then Chiara.
Sure, no, happy to answer that. So, I mean, yes, of course, we can speak in terms of moral responsibility. The Doha process, many of us would have observed the deeply flawed process. It was a process in which key stakeholders were excluded from the process. And even if we think in terms of the language of the Women, Peace and Security agenda under the UN Security Council, various UN Security Council resolutions, the extent to which that process had any semblance of a relationship with the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and including women's civil society and other stakeholders in ensuring a fair, open and transparent process, which really begs a different kind of question as to what the value of WPS is anymore. Because I think there's a really big moment for transnational feminist actors to really seriously interrogate what the last 20 years of their engagement on that agenda has meant. What we do know about Doha is we had an agreement signed between the US and if you look at the name of the thing, the title of the Doha agreement itself is so indicative of the challenges, where the entity with whom the agreement is made is named in such convoluted terms because it speaks to the inability of the government making the agreement to actually name the entity with which it is signing with. And also it's worth noting that many of the annexes to the Doha agreement have never been made public. So we have an agreement which actually we don't know what many of the full content of that agreement is. This leaves open, I think, the point that many of us continue to make is that a full inclusive peace process has never been initiated in Afghanistan. And the calls for that kind of inclusive process are still live. They're live because the parties, all of the parties to the conflict, were not included in the process. And given what we know about the current instability of Afghanistan in terms of effective control of territory and ongoing hostilities, which would at the very least indicate that we have a common Article 3 / Protocol 2 conflict in play in parts of the territory, then I think that need for a comprehensive process has not gone away, however much the actor who just left the scene would like to say it's unnecessary. And in terms of nomenclature, I can only speak to the nomenclature that my mandate uses in our communications. We use the nomenclature when we discuss the situation. We speak of the de facto authorities. There has been no formal recognition of the Taliban by any government. I would also say that it's important to note that the Credentials Committee of the United Nations has not indicated that the representatives of the Taliban are recognized for credentialing purposes at the UN, which goes to another question in the Q&A, that it is the officials of the former government who remain the ambassadors and representatives recognized under the credentialing process at the UN, slightly different from the state recognition process that Kiera outlined. So. Thanks.
Thank you, Kiara.
Sorry, the audio. Yeah, no, thank you. It's indeed, I mean, nobody has recognized the Taliban as the new government yet. So indeed, using a term like de facto authority might actually shows what's the reality on the ground, without going as far as saying that they are indeed the government in the country. Now, for IHL purposes, the situation is quite different because, as I mentioned before, IHL really gives a clear criterion in order to recognize the government, which is effective control over the territory and the population. So for IHL purposes and not for other purposes under international law, this is pretty straightforward. The Taliban are the new government, not just the de facto authority, but they actually represent the state. Now, obviously, here the problem is whether it's actually a welcome development that under IHL and under general international law, we have different criteria in order to identify a government. Personally, while I see why IHL needs clear criteria, so IHL, in order to determine, like, identifying the government is crucial to classify the conflict and to know whether a conflict is non-international or international, who are the state parties and who are the rebel forces. And IHL needs clarity. So it's in line with the rationale of IHL to actually have use the effectiveness criterion as opposed to democratic entities or free and fair elections that are a bit more fluid sometimes in terms, or more difficult to assess than effective control. So there is a reason why IHL chooses it. However, personally, I'm not a big fan of, and I find that it's a bit of a paradox when you have IHL choosing one criterion, which is not exactly the criterion used under international law, especially when we talk about recognition of governments. And it's not the first time. I mean, we have the huge debate between overall and effective control and the TADIC, between the ICJ, the ICTY, about what is the test to attribute actions of non-state actors to states, where at the end of the day, IHL is providing a different criterion compared to general international law and under the law of responsibility. So it's not the first time that we have these IHL peculiarities. However, I believe that in particular when it comes to the recognition of or identification of the government and the entity that represents the state, I'm very much in favor of having the same criteria under IHL and under international law. This is not the case. So again, for IHL purposes, the Taliban are the government. NTs obviously creates challenges that we all know, but this is the answer under IHL. While I do agree that with regard to public international law, it's less clear-cut, and therefore de facto authority might be the best way to go at the moment.
Thank you, Chiara. I think yours and Fionnuala's answers highlight the fact that the Taliban takeover triggers a lot of questions on who's representing the country at so many levels, being accreditation at the United Nations, IHL purposes, and also one layer of complexity is due to the fact that the Taliban is considered a terrorist organization. So Fionnuala, if I can steal 2 minutes of your time to answer Khalid's question, who's saying what are the legal and moral obligation of the UN to consider that some of the Taliban members are subject to sanctions and how to navigate that?
I think it's an extremely complex navigation. I think we're in the middle of it. I don't want to suggest that we have the answer yet. As Khalid rightly notes, so I'm not going to speak to moral obligations. It's just important to note that the United Nations works in multiple conflict contexts, where through its humanitarian entities, it deals with multiple actors, some of whom may be formally designated under UN sanctions, some of whom where there will be humanitarian exemptions in place, and work in contexts where national systems. So we're focused on UN designations, but it's to say there's an enormous layer of national designations way to fall below that have implications in multiple countries. So as a legal matter, the current listing poses an enormous problem because it makes it extremely difficult to, in practice, cooperate with ministries who are led by persons who are designated under those lists. Because in practice, it's likely the case that we already, many are running afoul of those provisions. And so what we need is humanitarian exemptions to get us out of this problem. So that is what would both enable United Nations entities to do their work in a way that does not have them fall foul, but also for other impartial humanitarian actors are also very nervously sitting in the space. So the issue is not just for the entities, it's also, remember, all of the support that goes through, it has to go through banks and other private actors. So we're not just talking about kind of international entities trying to figure out what they can and can't do. In order for them to do their work, they work through all these other intermediaries who are extremely risk averse about running afoul of designated sanctions regimes. And so it's I think just this mosaic of challenge, and it's one that is like is right before us in the next couple of months with the renewal of 1267. And with many apologies to all, I have to go, but I'm really appreciative of the conversation and the interest in these questions, and hope that all of us remained deeply concerned with and connected to the issues that are present in Afghanistan.
Thank you so much for your time and for getting the message across. And yeah, speak soon. Now I'd like to take two questions that are addressed to Sarah specifically. The first one is by Professor Sassoli. You've touched upon it before. He was wondering, who is going to be left, which or how many human rights defenders are going to be left in Afghanistan if most of them are being evacuated. You've explained that some people have voluntarily chosen to stay and that it's very important to support those people in their work. Can you speak a little bit as to what kind of support we can give from the outside? And also, Mariana has a question as regards your view on the role of NGOs when it comes to evacuation, especially big international ones. Have they been involved? Have you been working with them? And how do you see their role in the future? So basically, has there been a reconciliation between voluntary effort by people like yourself and bigger structures who had been involved for a while in Afghanistan?
First of all, thank you for those questions. I've been keeping an eye on the chat there, and they're wonderful questions. And I'm very sorry for depriving you all of Fionnuala a little more. I ran over time. I'm sorry. It's been 2.5 months of living in a cave. So to address the first questions, this is a very important one. And this is one of the very first events that I'm doing since I started doing this work, and I'm phasing it out. And I think it's a very important one. And I really wish it was broader conversations about this, because as I said, the point is not to drain Afghanistan of its resources, right? But if somebody is being referred to evac workers, it's not my place to issue judgment as to whether or not they should stay. They make their own risk assessment. And, it doesn't mean that they're not going to return. And again, this is a life decision that is not my place to make. But yes, some have chosen to stay. You may have seen a little bit in the media that there was a big protest the week after the Taliban took over, mostly led by women. The courage that they displayed that day, I really wish there had been more coverage of them. I really wish there was more visibility, because I think that's crucial in the way of responding to that. I think we cannot let Afghanistan slide. And I know everybody just has so much emotional bandwidth and so much time spent to focus in a world that is in crisis and has been in crisis for a very long time. But visibility and transparency ensures accountability. It will be way more difficult for an oppressive regime to attack those women if we pay attention to them and we ensure that their voices are being amplified and platformed. And the media cycle is what it is. We all know that. But I think it's very important to also platform Afghan women, those that have made it out, if they can speak safely, of course, because the issue remains in terms of security. I work in national security, so sadly, I'm all too aware of that. But that some of their family may be staying behind. So if they speak up, they will be at risk. To listen to them and what their needs are. What do they want us to do? What are the specific demands for the world that has led them into this situation? How can this help take shape? I don't think this is my place to answer that question, but I do think it's time to give Afghan women and Afghan human rights defenders the space and the time to speak for themselves. I think we've been supplanting them for too long. That's the answer to the first question. I hope it helps. And as far as NGOs go, so that's it's kind of been difficult because there's zero coordination and there's zero communication. Again, this was a very ad hoc effort, and it's been very difficult to reach out because everybody was using their own personal contacts. And of course, my contact was security contacts. But I've had a lot of referrals from Too Young to Wed, and I think they've been really present in Afghanistan, and they really should be supported because, especially again, as both Finio and I said, the situation in those camps, especially in Baghdad province, is very dire, and we have seen a large uptick into the sale of young girls in marriage, so the rest of the family could afford food. And we've seen marriage for kids as long as 4. So this is very difficult. So of course, those NGOs need to be present. Open Society Foundation worked very much in parallel. I don't know who they worked with, but I know they were present. And as many of you may know already, the UN Humanitarian Air Service that is operated by the World Food Programme works on a system of clearance that is conducted by OSHA. So usually large NGOs have this clearance that they are allowed to operate. So we were actually reaching out to those big NGOs, especially because those that could afford those flights, because UNHCR flights are about $350 per person, I think, $375 around that area. So if you have, a couple of hundred of people, it's starting to be a huge baseline, financially speaking. So small NGOs could not afford to use those UNHCR flights. So OSF, I know, has been there. We've had the International Commission of Jurists as well, with a focus on legal professionals, because of course we've had the lawyers, the prosecutors, and the judges that had in the past jailed Taliban fighters under Taliban rules, under the presidency of Hamid Karzai, and very obviously they were number ones on the Taliban list when they took over. So some NGOs, of course, have their own angle, their own prism, their own, sort of triage that they're doing. They're not going to take just any human rights defenders. They're going to take, again, the legal professionals. Some are going to focus on journalists. So we had Article 19 that was also very present for the evacuation of journalists. I had a bunch of BBC people coming through me. We've had some specific funds that were attached to UNESCO. And those who stayed were UNICEF, because there are 2 orphanages in Kabul that are operated by UNICEF, so UNICEF never left. And there is a question of how many can operate remotely. Actually, not really. I think that's why it was very interesting to see that we finally had an IOM contact in the last couple of days. It's not clear yet what the mandate is and whether or not they're going to be able to facilitate some things. I'm very reluctant to continue letting this be a volunteer-led effort, because legally this is frankly not ideal. And again, we just don't have the resources. So short of a humanitarian corridor, it would be fantastic to have stronger support for IOM and UNHCR. But again, we are going to be facing a shift from an evacuation of at-risk defenders to a shift from addressing starvation and displacement within Afghanistan, which is a country that is vastly rural. So you have entire provinces that are extremely hard to reach. And it's actually frightening, but without being there, again, there's only so much we can do. So yes, but thank you for your questions.
Thank you. We have one last question from Erika, and I'm not sure we have the answer, so I'm just going to ask it nonetheless. Do we know if the World Bank is financing any project that goes to the protection of human rights? And do we know if UNICEF has been able to conduct work remotely in Afghanistan? It's okay to say we don't know, but I owe it to Erika to ask.
Wow, the question of money has been a very, very difficult one for all the issues that Finio outlined very, very obviously. So I do not know. UNICEF is working. This is correct. As I said, UNICEF is present. They have orphanages in Kabul. They've been working. They've never left. Working remotely is difficult. The OHCHR office, for instance, relocated to Kazakhstan. I assume that the long-term plan is to eventually be able to return to Afghanistan once the situation stabilizes. The World Bank, I'm not sure, because this is not a body that I'm comfortable with. And not comfortable, I mean, not very familiar, but I wouldn't know where to go to answer your questions. But I know that the Development Fund have actually, staffers at the Development Fund have tried to set up some sort of an escrow, for lack of a better word, for funds that need to go to Afghanistan in a way that it does not have to be, traveling through banks that are closed, or going to places or people that, are those sanctions list or are not going to aid a humanitarian effort. So it is, logistically, it's very, very difficult. But yeah, it's the humanitarian exemption issue that Fiona and I raised is basically where I think you want to go. We need to have a very frank and frankly honest conversation about sanctions and humanitarian crisis, and who we're going to work with and how. It's a very uncomfortable conversation. It's a very difficult one to be having. We have created an entire system of red tape, and now we realize that we have to cut through this in order to get stuff done. So it's, but this is a conversation that should have started a while ago, but I'm very happy to see that it's starting to have.
Thank you so much. Chiara, do you want to add something?
I think Sarah covered it pretty well, and to be honest, I wouldn't know more than Sarah actually said personally. And again, with regard to the World Bank, I'm not familiar either, so I wouldn't be able to elaborate more. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank also Khalid and Mariana on the chat, who've also informed on some projects and some institutions. We have a couple of minutes left, so if you have a burning question that you haven't dared to ask, please write it in the chat. I'll give a few seconds, otherwise I'm going to wrap up this session.
I mean, we're all civilians. We're all civilians. I think if you have any form of platform where you can, again, amplify those voices and share what's going on. I'm very worried about people forgetting what's going on. There was a lot of conversation around the formal withdrawal of the US because, of course, and it happened to coincide with the 20 years of 9/11. So sure, tons of conversations. But if there was a way to keep the ball rolling, in my view, on how to support human rights defenders that cannot be left, and how to have a much broader conversation on refugee resettlement schemes, then that would be great. But this is a global issue. I don't have the answer to this.
No, thanks. Thanks so much. And with regards to the question for hope for progress for organizations like Geneva Call, I think there is hope for progress given how bleak the situation is. It's about staying engaged, keeping the conversation going. It's also about being fully aware that this is a test run, I think, for the UN counterterrorism framework and the humanitarian exemptions, because those exemptions have not been designed to deal with de facto authority or entities designed as terrorists who serve in governmental functions. So how do you make this work for the people on the ground, I think is a test run for the international community as a whole. I want to thank you both, Sarah and Chiara, and also Finuda, who has left, for having engaged in the conversation and for helping us keeping the conversation going, for also being honest and interacting with our panelists, with our participants. And on that note, I want to wish everybody a good afternoon or morning or evening, and goodbye.